So what we have here are the 4 women doctors of the church. And I did this in my response to the Vatican's investigation of women religious several years ago. And I spent a couple days in total anger about it, and then I thought, I'm not giving those boys my anger. They're not worthy of it. So I thought that their more creative response was to do a drawing. So this is called a Heavenly Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And each of these 4 women spoke truth to power in their time. Catherine of Siena on the upper left, you know, she got on her horse with her followers, who called her Mama, and went from Rome up to Avignon, France, where the Pope was living in absolute splendor and luxury. If you've ever had a bottle of Chateauneuf de Pape, you know what I'm talking about. Still one of the most expensive wines today. And she said to the Pope, you get back to Rome where you belong. That's where your people want you. And she called him my sweet baboo, which is an Italian term of affection. And guess what? He listened to her. He went back to Rome, and history changed because of her courage, you know. On the lower left, we have Terez of Lisieux, who wrote in her memoirs, I want to be a priest and a warrior. She hated the fact that even because she was a woman, in her own monastery chapel, she was not allowed beyond the altar rail unless she was the sacristan. So when she was assigned that job, she loved to go in, and she'd go in every day to get the linens to iron them, and she'd knock on the tabernacle door, and she'd say, are you in there today? How's it going inside? You know, she had this very personal relationship with Jesus. And that at that time, women were not supposed to be allowed to study Scripture on their own. They were supposed to have a priest come in to explain things to them. So she had to read Scripture all by herself to come to understand this personal Jesus that she saw as brother. On the lower right, we have Teresa of Avila, who was called in before the Inquisition several times for her writings. Again, women weren't even supposed to have books or read Scripture on their own, and here she's writing the greatest classics of mystical literature in church history, one of the most brilliant people, women or men, of all time. And she had to write in ways that said, now I'm just a silly woman, what do I know, but. And then she'd launch into these great miraculous stories. And her classics is the castle, the interior castle, so that's what she's holding in her arm. And on the upper right, we have last year's Hildegard of Bingen, one of my favorite, who was a music composer. She came up with music therapy. She read 3 or 4 languages. She read every known piece of literature in the world at that time as this Benedictine nun. And she was also the only woman in the entire Middle Ages allowed to preach in church. As she was gaining more and more attention, she was noted for healing. People would flock to Bingen to get herbal remedies. She was an expert on herbal remedies, and she composed music. I often listen to it when I'm working. You can get her CDs, you know, live. But she changed Gregorian chant. You know, she was a genius on every level. And people started flocking to her monastery because it became a center for healing. Well, the boys upstairs, of course, didn't like all that, you know, all this attention she's getting. So people were saying, you know, she should be kicked out and blah, blah, blah. Well, St. Bernard, no lover of women, came to her defense and wrote the Pope and said, she's the real deal. So the Pope, whose name escapes me right now, designated her as a preacher. She went all through Germany in preaching in churches and cathedrals, the gospel. The only woman allowed to do it. Now, here's the best part of her story. She was excommunicated at the age of 79. She lived till 80. And she was excommunicated because a man had committed suicide. And in those days, church law said they could not be buried in consecrated ground. And she was horrified by this. She said, we don't know what went on in this guy's mind and heart before he died. You know, it's not who are we to judge? So she allowed him to be buried in the monastery cemetery, and that got her excommunicated. She spent the last year of her life petitioning Rome, and they finally overturned it, but they said it took everything out of her, and she died a year later. So she died in good graces. Right after she died, she was called saint. People were flocking to Bingen for pilgrimage. Anyhow, there they are, the 4 doctors, and it's just they're wonderful reminders to us of when will they ever learn, you know, that the church is supposed to be about a community of believers all walking with each other, not judging each other, but saying, I know you're weak, and here's how I find my strength, and you share with me yours.